Good morning, Facebook, if you're in the Central Time Zone, and good afternoon to our friends on the East Coast. My name is Andrew William Smith, and I'm a DJ and podcaster from Cookeville, Tennessee. And you're going to be listening to another edition of Ordinary Takes, which is a pop culture podcast that's the joint production of ordinaryspace.org and teacherontheradio.com. And today, as my guest, coming in all the way from North Carolina, is journalist, author, just all around amazing person, Mark Kemp. And I discovered Mark Kemp when I was trying to wrestle with my identity as a white dude in the South, who's also an abolitionist and a civil rights activist, but a huge fan of music. And I was trying to understand the Allman Brothers Band and REM, but I was also trying to understand, the freedom struggle from Selma to Nashville to Greensboro to Atlanta, of course, where there's that famous preacher that I love so much. And so I found Mark Kemp when I was on this dig to understand music, roots music in the South. And I found his amazing book, Dixie Lullaby, a story of music, race, and new beginnings in a new South. And from there, I found out that he worked for Creative Loafing, a weekly. He'd been out in the West Coast in San Francisco. He's worked for Rolling Stone. He's done a stint in New York. But he's returned to the South, to his homeland, and to the people of the South that he loves so much to continue to write. And currently he's doing a lot of blogging and Facebooking about music. And he's taken kind of a straight job, if you will, as a journalist for the community, serving the state of North Carolina in their arts and culture community. And welcome to Ordinary Takes, Mark Kemp.
Hi, how's it going, Andrew? It's so great to be here. You know, it's I watch your Facebook page all the time, and I stalk you too. So, yeah, it's great to be here.
Yeah, so Mark didn't know that I was a pretty huge fanboy of his, but I guess that's become mutual because we have so many shared interests around social justice. And, I meant to tell you off camera, but, I follow so many people that are kind of doing, the anti-racist white guy thing. And it's such a tightrope that we have to walk because we really want to amplify and privilege Black voices, especially during Black History Month. Right. And of course, we know it's not a month. For us, it's a career of solidarity and of being, I don't even like the word allies, accomplices to justice work. But in doing so, today, we are going to come from the place of fans. We're fans of Black music, and it's Black History Month. Both of us, when we finally agreed to do this just a couple of days ago, we thought, wouldn't it be great to bring in Rhiannon Giddens and Amethyst Kia? And we both probably could have come up with a long list of contemporary roots musicians. But I know that NPR is putting out a big special on that Our Native Daughters album that came out 2 years ago. And Rhiannon Giddens has a new album coming out. I think it's going to be in April. So we're going to get into it today. But
Amethyst also has a new single coming out really soon that I've heard that's great. And we did reach out to her, and she was very appreciative. She couldn't because it was last minute, but I just wanted to mention that she wanted to come on.
So for the people who haven't read Dixie Lullaby, or I think I've read it and then bought copies to give to friends. Awesome. Can you go through just the elevator version, or the passing at a show, you meet somebody at a show version, a little bit of your lineage with the South and popular music, and then we'll get into our topic for today, which is to talk about some of our favorite Black artists in the Americana genre. But specifically, we're going to talk a lot about Black women artists today in roots music and Americana. But Mark, why don't you just tell our audience, for friends of mine maybe that haven't met you yet or heard of your work, a little bit about your story and how closely linked it is to North Carolina.
Sure. I'd be glad to. When I got the idea to write Dixie Lullaby, I was at I guess I was at Rolling Stone or MTV. I was at Rolling Stone and MTV in the late 90s. And in the earlier 90s, I edited a magazine for many years called Option. And it was an alternative culture magazine. Now alternative has become a marketing term. But back then, it was really kind of edgy and, on the fringes. And we covered everything from so-called alternative rock to free jazz and world music and contemporary classical and avant-garde stuff. And so for many years, I had been immersed in that kind of music and was kind of, you get typecast as I'm the indie rock guy or the, alternative guy or whatever. And when I got to Rolling Stone, obviously, it's more mainstream, and MTV as well. I wrote a piece for the New York Times called "Coming Home to My Southern Roots," and I had gone to see a concert at Wetlands in New York by a band called the Screaming Cheetah Wheelies, and Government Mule was also on that bill. And they're both very Southern, contemporary at that time, Southern rock bands, new Southern rock bands, because you think of Southern rock, you think of the 70s, but this was the 90s. And I went backstage that night, and a couple of members of the Allman Brothers was there, and Government Mule, and 15 or so years, I started hearing my Southern accent come back in. I was just, "Hey man, what's up?" And and I went, "Oh my God, I'm comfortable back here. I'm with my people," and it's beautiful, And I wrote, and then I wrote this piece for the Times about how that happens, how I had disguised my Southern accent for many years because I was ashamed of it, because I didn't want to hear those. You get this thing when you're in New York. You're from the South, you're from North Carolina. Is everybody racist there? All these kind of things that I didn't expect to hear. What do you mean? Is everybody racist? You know what I mean? And so somebody even once asked, if I fly down there, am I going to have to be careful when I get off the plane? They were afraid, they'd be met by KKK members or something, which is understandable right now. But so I was just kind of trying to reconnect with my roots, and the way I came up in the 70s, and I love the Allman Brothers. I love the Rolling Stones and T-Rex and all those bands, but the Allman Brothers, when I first heard them when I was a kid, I was like 12, 13, something like that. It blew me away because these were guys who looked like me, and they sounded like me, and they wrote about the things that were around me, and identify it. And they wore jeans and T-shirts and stuff like that rather than sparkly, glammy sort of outfits. And I really, really connected with the Allman Brothers band heavily. And then, of course, I got into high school, and there was Leonard Skinner and all that stuff. And then I started seeing this dichotomy, what the drive-by truckers call the duality of the Southern thing. And I was talking to my girlfriend at that time, and she said, "You need to write a book about this." And she was from up north. She was the niece of Jan Winter, so she grew up around Rolling Stone, and she said, "You really need to write a book about that, because nobody's written that book." And I started thinking more and more in those terms. A lot of white rock journalists have written about Black music. And a lot of them kind of scoffed at the whole Southern rock movement, just a bunch of yahoos down south, and that's not everybody, but some. And I wanted to give voice to being a young white kid who grew up at a time when, when I was in the second grade, they integrated my school, so I remember that integration, and I wanted to kind of tell that story. I can't write with authority about Black music. I can write with a fan's authority and a rock journalist's authority or music journalist's authority, but I'm not Black. I'm white. So I wanted to tell that story of growing up in this very confusing time, because back then we didn't talk about tolerance, classes, or diversity. It just, it was when I was in the second grade, it was announced that suddenly these kids from this other school, Central, were going to be coming over here Okay. Are you were have I been here the whole time?
Mark, I think we might be experiencing a little bit of lag on your feed, and hopefully, I don't know if you can move closer to the router or anything like that. You did cut out there for a second, and I must have maybe cut out on you also.
It may be the weather because we got kind of an ice storm out here.
Oh,
So
we're having terrible weather here in Tennessee.
yeah,
So when I was reading your book, I remember now when you mentioned the Willies, Mike Ferris is based in Nashville,
yeah,
and he's doing this gospel thing, this
yeah,
Blue Eyed Soul.
yeah.
He's a soul singer, and he's got this. I mean, he's a white guy, but most of his band and his backup singers are black guys and women. It's just a beautiful multicultural kind of soul, kind of Stax Records revival. He won a best roots gospel album a couple of years ago, and just I was in Detroit, but I did a brief stint living in Atlanta, working at the Open Door community with Ed Loring, and he's this very liberal minister, but radical left minister, but he preaches like a Southern Baptist with a huge drawl, and it kind of just puts chill in your bones, but it also scares you a little bit. But I think, we were all kids in Michigan, and we kept hearing about Athens, Georgia, and we were so into Michael Stipe and Peter Buck, and we were hearing all this kind of Southern Gothic, and then Howard Finster's folk art, and then they were reading, oh, you got to go read Flannery O'Connor and William Faulkner. So I'm a literary guy too, so I was learning a kind of, this alternate history that I had never heard of before. And of course, my dad had marched in the South in the 60s, but for him, it was like so crazy. He was a young adult living in Chicago, and he got on an airplane, when he was like 23 or 24 to go to Selma, and it was just so wild. I think even for him. And so this idea that your friends in New York, as soon as I moved down here, I moved here in the 90s to go live on a hippie commune. And then I've made my way to a college town after that and worked in academia here in the South for 20 years. But I remember my friends from Detroit saying very similar things. Like they weren't sure it was going to be safe.
Right.
And they weren't sure if it was safe for them to visit. But, I felt safe until Bree Newsom took down the flag in South Carolina. And as soon as that flag went down in South Carolina, it went up on the back of pickup trucks all over where I live. And
that was a very pivotal time. Bree lived in Charlotte, which is where I came back to when I started working on the book. And that was a very pivotal time. And so that's when the line was kind of drawn for the where we are right now. If I wrote Dixie Lullaby today, it would be a little bit of a different book, because I have a lot of compassion, and compassion is not bad, but I have a lot of compassion for poor, working white people, and I kind of I don't defend the racism, but I try to put it in context. Like there's a group called Rednecks for Black Lives. They're based in the Appalachians, and the book was kind of intended as that way. This is a class thing, as much as it is a racial divide, and the power structure. Is still, I think I've gone out again. I keep going out, but now it's a little different. It's like folks know better, and they're still choosing to go down that racist path. So I don't have as much sympathy for white working class people who are going down that path now, because there's just too much information. We know too much. You're making a choice now, whereas before you might have been more, influenced by, the white power structure who's trying to divide and conquer. So, and I don't know where all that was going.
Well, I think we have to go back to, that's why the music is so important, because these alliances go back so far. There was so much interracial solidarity going on behind the scenes, going all the way back to the union movement and to the Great Depression, and definitely the civil rights movement that we know of that starts in the 1950s was already going on. And the left, the more I learned about the 20s, and the 30s, the American left was huge in the 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
so and the idea of Richard Wright, for example, is writing his novels, Native Son and stuff like that. So I mean, this thing has been with us for a long time. So yes, we can't really excuse folk, but it's interesting that we can teach folk about the history because, like, for example, redneck being such a contested term, there's this
Mhm.
alternate story that has to do with the red bandanas worn
Yeah.
by the coal miners
Right.
at Blair, at the Battle of Blair Mountain and in Matewan, West Virginia, where they're fighting for their lives against the
Mhm.
boss just to be able to earn a living wage and to be able to, not sleep in a tent.
And the Rednecks for Black Lives group, really, I learned I learned a lot. And there are things that I wrote about, the denigrating term redneck, in my book. But in a way, the Rednecks for Black Lives group up in the coal mining country had taught me that, that's not that was a term of pride, kind of like any term, any name of pride. So I've gained much more of an understanding of a lot of things since I wrote the book. The book's very old. It came out in 2004. So, I mean, there's a lot that's changed then. I might write it differently today, but the spirit of the book would be the same. The spirit of the book is that, we were a unique generation that grew up right at the time they were integrating the schools, and we had to kind of fend for ourselves. And what I did was I listened to music, and I had a group of friends, some of whom were Black, who brought their music into play. I brought our music, the music that I grew up with, into play, and we taught each other. We kind of learned from each other. And I learned from their Funkadelic albums, and they learned from my Allman Brothers albums, and we got tight. And I'm still good friends with. I live in a small town now, my old hometown, and I'm still friends with these guys, and we've been friends since 1970. Before, and
I don't know if people understand because so many people today don't have that shared experience, but what it meant for people like ourselves to grow up in an integrated school. I think if I had not gone to my community was Shaker Heights when I was younger before moving to Detroit, and I went to the quote unquote Black elementary school. There was two, and we had voluntary busing. So you went, and Shaker's a small community, but you could just go little ways across town, and I was in my classroom the only Black male, and there was maybe 3 or 4 Black females. So it was majority Black elementary school, and that was the formative. It was it was funkadelic, and it was disco too, because I was in the 70s, and so I was learning about a totally different kind of music: R&B, soul, funk, and disco. I mean, Earth, Wind, and Fire, and that song Car Wash, and I mean, and it was Black kids at my elementary school that told me about craft work.
Wow,
and and
that's
and
because
and my,
African Bavada.
and my brother and his buddies were all listening to like the Eagles
Mm-hmm.
and Kiss, and I love it all now. I go back to the 70s, and I'm just like I love every bit of it, pretty much with few exceptions. But I think growing up in an integrated school is something that I can never take for granted, looking back, and how it shaped me to be different than a lot of my peers. Because here in Cookeville, we have kids coming from these small towns, and Cookeville is a huge white majority city. And if it wasn't for our student athletes that we have at the university, the numbers of Black students would be so small. But they have these kids coming from these tiny towns across Tennessee coming to Cookeville, and Cookeville seems integrated to them because they'd never gone to school with people of color, for people from other countries. And we have a lot of international students, though that's gone down in the last couple of years. The international students haven't been coming to study in the States, first due to the Trump policies, and then due to COVID. So we've lost a lot of our international student population. But when I got to Cookeville from Detroit, I thought I joked to my friends. I said I'd never seen so many white people in my entire life.
Well, what's funny is that in the South, we have traditionally lived more closely together because there are more Black people in the South. In my hometown, it's a lower percentage, but of minorities in general. But generally in the South, there has been more living next to each other. In the North, I found that because of the neighborhoods are so insular, there's more tolerance of different cultures, but but those cultures live in their, you kind of live in little villages, sort of. And whereas here we kind of grow up. We always grow up together. It's strange, because there's traditionally been more racism here, and it's because of our history. I mean, obviously, it's our history of slavery and Civil War and all that stuff. But there's it exists in the North and out west too, in sort of like it's in sort of ways where I don't really understand this culture. I support them, and I'm being very general, but I support them, but I don't understand them. Whereas down here, we all live together, so there's more of an understanding, but a lot of antipathy, I guess. And that's changed so much since like the 60s and 70s. I mean, we just radically. But yeah, that antipathy is still there, and is still, and it's much hotter than I realized even when I was writing my book. You know, the book, I end on a very optimistic note. We're finally coming to terms with our, the South anyway, coming to terms with our past, and we're healing wounds and all that stuff. Boy, was I wrong. In a lot of ways, that was pie in the sky thinking. I just didn't realize how horrible it still is, or how horrible it was going to get. And I think that has a lot with just, people being fearful and threatened by, Black and brown people, becoming, well, larger population, but also in power positions. It's always should have been that way, but now that it is, we have a lot of people who are angry and resentful for that. So that's the issues we're dealing with now, more than the power structure beating down. Just that fear of the other entering my world.
We have this weird disconnect with folk that I've met when Black Lives Matter came to the rural communities. And apparently we had a really successful and very large Black Lives Matter event in Cookeville, but there was so many death threats and so many of these fabricated rumors. This whole there was these anonymous emails. I don't even know if they were anonymous, but there were these alleged emails that were sent to small town police departments and sheriff's departments all over the country about the busloads of Antifa. And apparently, whenever there's a progressive event in a town like this, they just assume that there's no progressive people in that town,
right?
And so that the only way we can have a progressive or a liberating event is if we ship in busloads. The first Black Lives Matter event on our campus took place by a small African-American fraternity on our campus. And the organizers were maybe 10 Black students, but they called it Black Lives Matter. And just because they called it that, the rumor mill on the conservative Facebook sites in town was that there was going to be busloads of Black activists being shipped into Cookeville to, quote unquote, rape the white girls. This was in 2016.
Right. The bizarre thing about that is that that's absolutely no different from the way it was in 1962 or whatever. No different. It's those same talking points that are pushed out to these people. Like, I mean, they don't know who Antifa is. They don't know that Antifa means anti-fascist, which everybody should be. They believe that Black Lives Matter is this communist group that's going to, I mean, this is old stuff, old fears, a communist, because the organizers of the original organizers of Black Lives Matter do support socialist policies, which is great to me, but to your average conservative who consumes conservative media, that's the biggest threat in the world is, oh my God, they're going to be, they're communists. And they call Martin Luther King Jr. a communist because he also sympathized with socialist ideas. Nothing's, I hate to be so pessimistic now because there was a sense of optimism to my book, but we're right back there where we were in 1962, 63, 64, fighting the same damn fight, Um, that's why music is so important to me, because music is always, that place where we can all go and learn from one another.
So you're
Music
listening to Ordinary Takes, which is a podcast based out of Cookeville, Tennessee, co-hosted by Ordinary Space Fanzine and Teacher on the Radio. I am Teacher on the Radio, Andrew Smith. My guest today is Mark Kemp, a journalist and author from North Carolina. And he sent me this list of fundamental texts for understanding Black roots music. We want to talk about some of our favorite contemporary artists today, but saying that we've gone back to the 60s, it was the music that was so beautifully, galvanizing. And it wasn't just, Bob Dylan and Joan Baez, but yes, and Peter, Paul, and Mary. Yes, that's what I grew up with. My parents, like, it was Dylan, but it was Odetta. But the top of your list is the Staple Singers, and the Staple Singers were like the house band, for the movement for a while. But they were putting out pop records that were getting radio airplay and that were pop records. So,
and
way to go.
A lot of people think of Staple Singers, a lot of white people, I guess, think of Staple Singers and they think, I'll Take You There and those songs. But they go so far back, obviously the early roots of being gospel, but they did Dylan albums of Dylan covers. Hard Rain's Gonna Fall. They did the best version of Hard Rain's Gonna Fall other than Leon Russell, to me. And with the circle being broken and all this stuff, I mean, they were crucial to the civil rights movement. We hear about Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and the whitewashed version, which Bob Dylan and Joan Baez were fantastic and they were important. Phil Oakes, but so were Staple Singers and so many others. Odetta, as you mentioned,
Nina Simone, and then you've listed out, leading us into the roots side. You list out, Etta James, and Ray Charles.
Well, what the reason I listed those is because we were going to talk about contemporary African American Americana in country music, right? Because only recently, has there been a lot of attention paid? Oh, look at all the Black people in country music. Well, it's been all along. We've had Black people in country music all along. Staple Singers. Fats Domino covering, Hank Williams, Ray Charles with his two modern sounds of country music albums, Solomon Burke, Esther Phillips, Joe Tex did that great song "Skip a Rope," which is an anti-racism song, and Etta James, Almost Persuaded. I mean, it's a beautiful cover of that song. The Supremes did a country album. A lot of people don't know that. Bobby Womack did a country album. The Pointer Sisters in the 70s had Fairy Tale, which is a country song. It just goes on and on and on and on, because country music comes from both working class Black and white musical styles. I mean, that's where it comes from. But Nashville put that white stamp. This is white music. This is white culture. This is, white identity to country music for so many years that it obviously, it turned Black audiences off to that kind of music for many, many years. Now, in fairly recently, in the 2000s, a lot of Black artists reclaimed their place in country and Americana music. The Carolina Chocolate Drops were essential in that reclaiming, because they taught us that a lot of those old string bands from way back in the 30s, 20s, and 30s were African American string bands. That's where bluegrass came from. Arnold Schultz playing with Bill Monroe, and there's bluegrass, and this the African American roots of country music are essential, and we hadn't been taught that for very many years.
The blues and gospel are kind of like the undercurrent. They're the root structure of American pop music, and so you can't get back to that without going through some blues and some gospel. And the similarities between kind of hillbilly. I just recently got into this Harry Smith jag and Alan Lomax jag that we were talking about a week ago over Facebook, and then I just bought a couple 78 sides just to hold them in my hand. But the old sleeves say hillbilly and race, and that meant country and blues, and it was segregated, but there was so much cross pollination at that time that it seems disingenuous to really purport that it was ever not together, right?
Yeah,
it's perception, and then it's industrial decision making. Because I remember growing up in the 80s and stuff, that definitely there was white radio stations and black radio stations, and so that segregation that started with quote hillbilly and quote race definitely continued on. But the cross pollinations, if you study Stax Records, you study what was going on at Fame and in Muscle Shoals, in the studio and in places like Memphis and Muscle Shoals, this integration and this cross pollination is getting richer and richer. It's never going away. It's just somehow being hid from the general public, to where your snap perception are, that's a black music, that's white music, but it's never been that. It's always been integrated.
Somebody makes that decision, and being involved in the music industry for years, I saw people making decisions about certain things that were just that person made that decision, so you have people in power making decisions about what kind of music is what kind of music, and then it's ridiculous, because there's no separating that stuff. I mean, people make music together. It's that simple, and they influence each other. But yeah, I'd love to talk about what some of the more recent stuff.
Let's Mark, let's totally go there. So you mentioned the Carolina Chocolate Drops.
Mm-hmm.
That first record dropped in 2010, it looks like. So they're starting in the aughts. I'm sorry. The Genuine Negro Jig is the big breakout, which is in 2010. They're starting in 2005. So this is literally the last 10 years. And then I'm thinking of other things too, like Little Nas X and Darius Rucker's version of Wagon Wheel. So you have this like huge kind of explosion of Black roots music in the last 10 years. So we're at
start. I wanted to bring Candia Crazy Horse on here, and I did message her, but it was last minute too, because she really. So in 2006, 2 years after the book came out, and the year that the book came out in paper, my book came out in paperback. I began as editor of Creative Loafing, and I needed a music editor. And my friend Candia Crazy Horse from New York, I'd known her, and we'd hung out in New York. I wanted to get her down there because I wanted a female African American music editor, because we'd had white male music editors at that paper from the time it was established, and it was time to change that. So she came down from New York, and she told me about Carolina Chocolate Drops. Shortly after she got there, she says, "Oh, there's this cool group. They're from around the Triangle area, and they've been jamming with this guy named Joe Thompson in Mebane, which is this tiny little town, who plays like string band country music, and they're called the Carolina Chocolate Drops." And I said, "Write about them," and that was 2006. From there, they really exploded, and to the point that they had that first breakthrough album that you're talking about, Genuine Negro Jig. And they've really changed the landscape. I think they and some others were really largely responsible for turning young Black musicians onto that and the banjo gathering where they met. There was a Black banjo gathering where the members of Carolina Chocolate Drops met, that was already brewing. But it's really made a big impact. And now you have Valerie June, and you have all these other people. Also in Nashville at that time, on the mainstream level, you had Reese Palmer, whose Country Girl came out in 2007. She's now, independent because, like every young, pretty woman who gets swallowed up by Nashville, they had an image of who they wanted Reese to be, and that's how she kind of came through on that first album. So she's since, become, herself, much more herself. But all that was going on like in the mid 2000s, and since then, there's just the dam is broken, and there's a tremendous amount of good stuff. Miko Marks came out right around that time too, and she's a tremendous country singer. And same sort of thing happened to her as happened to Reese. She was kind of developed as this pretty, Black girl who sang country music and had straightened hair, and now she's kind of come on into her own too, and she's independent. She's got a great song called "Good Night America." It's devastating. "Good Night America." It's devastating. But she had a song way back in 2007 called "9 Years Pushing 30," which was about a young Black boy who had to deal with people getting shot by police around him. You have Camera Thomas, who was in a power rock band called Earl Greyhound. She now lives in Durham, and she's doing some fantastic Americana, kind of Neil Young-y sort of stuff. Her song "You Wreck Me" is kind of got a Neil Young sensibility to it. And then Candia, the woman I was talking about herself, put out an album a few years ago called Stampede, and it's just there's more and more and more African American people joining with other Americana artists, and putting out, more and more music. It's just a lot has happened in the last 10 years to open up that field. Not so much country still, Nashville country, because Nashville country is a corporate thing in itself, but the Americana field is just, it's kind of exploding with wonderful roots music from African American musicians.
Rhiannon Giddens was quoted in the New Yorker that she still is having a hard time finding a Black audience for her music, and that she had even pitched some gigs, that would be more curated towards a Black audience, and that she had it been frustrating to her. And I'm sure, you've been to some big shows. I go to a lot of the festivals that are in, there's Bonnaroo in Manchester, and then in this region, it's just, until before COVID, there's just a huge number of music festivals. And so I've seen Mavis Staples, I don't know how many times, but when you have a band like the War and the Treaty that I saw live, I discovered War and the Treaty. Amazing, right?
When they sing together, you just feel that love that they have for each other.
They're so amazing. But I saw them at a show in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and you would have to work your eyes on the crowd to notice a single Black face in the crowd. So they're playing.
That's a problem. That is definitely a problem. It's really, while there are a lot of Black artists in this music, there isn't a large Black audience for it yet. That's the next. I think that's the next challenge. For people like Rhiannon is to find that audience, is to cultivate that audience, is to make it okay for young Black kids to say, okay, I want to go see this Americana artist, for more kids to be able to say that, because we push, our culture pushes, like I said, they make decisions and they push certain music, certain audiences, and that's the way mainstream popular culture works. We don't even realize how little we decide in our decision making. When I was a kid, I listened to what was pushed to me, and it's even 1,000 times worse now. It's this is what you listen to, and this is for you, and so it's a big challenge, and I hope that that it will be overcome. That eventually, young kids can. And it's happening. You got Afropunk, which has gotten really big from New York, and this is, young Black kids listening to, experimental music of all kinds. It's not, Afropunk isn't just punk, it's musicians of all kinds musicians of color of all kinds at a festival, and draws pretty big crowds of predominantly Black music lovers. So it is happening, and I think it's just more difficult in the country field when you see people like that dude, I can't even remember his name, make that comment, and make that tearful apology.
Oh, Morgan Wallen.
Yeah.
Oh, good Lord, have mercy.
I was talking, now I'm sober, and I see the error of my ways, and I hope he does, but I mean, we've seen that over and over and over and over again. And so when you see things like that, if I'm a Black kid and I see something like that, I'm like, this is the last thing I'm going to want to go and listen to, because it just means to me in my head a bunch of people who don't want me around.
Adia Victoria was tweeting about that, and she said she was getting a lot of great support, but also a lot of hate. So I think we need to keep telling people about this, and we need to be telling people, who like that genre of music about this, and then we need to be, and I think it's in the schools. I think that's where some of these artists, Jake Blunt, came up through like a music program, and he was getting musical training, and I think that's maybe, it isn't my second or third grade music teacher, I love to tell the story, got me listening to the Commodores, and that was when Brick House was popular. And I'm like, later on, looking back in life, I'm this middle-aged guy, and I'm like, did she listen to the lyrics? I was like 8 or 9 years old, and she said, go home and listen to Brick House, And so I think this if music teachers, for example, are bringing this to the schools, and people, the internet is put us into these camps and stuff, but it's also made all this stuff accessible.
Right.
You just have to, if you click the next, the next right click, left click, whatever, you're going to find some of this great music. I'm glad that you mentioned in our long list, you mentioned mostly women, but you mentioned Ben Harper.
Yeah.
And just sitting here talking to you today, I'm starting thinking about, Tracy Chapman. My buddy Scott in the comments, he was listening at least earlier, mentioned JS Andara. He's a kid who came from Kenya to be the next Bob Dylan. He moved to Minneapolis because that's where Dylan was from, and he's put out 2 unbelievable folk albums that are just stunning.
I have 10 women listed on there because, the reason Ben Harper's on there is because I was getting ready to do a list of the fellas, but I went, what, let's just focus on the women, because there's so many women doing so much great stuff. And that's just a drop in the bucket of what's come out in folk Americana and those kind of, but, you said something a minute ago, you said, we've got to tell them. And I don't think we, me and you.
Oh, no. Yeah. I know what you mean. Yeah, no, absolutely not.
I think that challenge is for the Black artists themselves to somehow, and I don't know the answer, and Rhiannon probably doesn't know the answer, is to somehow go out and rally, younger people, or rally is not the word, but expose younger people and make it okay. Just make it okay, because you and me talking about it ain't going to make young.
No, definitely not. But I'm thinking about my class. I've got integrated. As much as Cookville is talking about this stuff
there. Yeah,
talking about this in the college classroom. And I have a friend who graduated from Tech. She's a white middle school teacher, but she's in the Atlanta area, so she's got a wider audience. And I'm just thinking, just this big picture. But I don't mean any. I meant the most inclusive people who like this kind of music that breaks down these kinds of barriers, right, needs to let other people, because I mean I'm pretty seriously into this, but I probably found out about the Carolina chocolate drops 5 years after you found out about them, right? It's just important. I think it's really important. And then of course now you do this, and everybody says Rhiannon Giddens, but then they stop there. They don't go down the list. And so,
what most people, that's how they deal with any kind of music. And it's like, oh yeah, I know of so and so who is the kind of top on the totem pole of a very, very rich pot of music. And that's the way it is a lot of, yeah, I know Nirvana, who's Sonic Youth, um, that's just the way it works in mainstream culture. But, there's just so much out there. And as you were saying before, every time I go to one, Birds of Chicago show or a Kamara Thomas show or a Carolina Chocolate Drop show or a Valerie June show, it's predominantly white. And it must be so frustrating to the artists themselves, on the one hand, appreciating their audience, and on the other hand, God, I wish there was more faces that look like mine out there.
So I'm Andrew Smith, teacher on the radio, and I'm with Mark Kemp, and we're on Ordinary Takes, and we're talking about the importance of listening to and amplifying Black artists in the Americana genre. And we have talked about Rhiannon Giddens and the Carolina Chocolate Drops, Valerie June, Rissy Palmer, Miko Marks. Did you mention that you said something about a song called "Good Night America" that came out last year, by Miko Marks? I think, and there's I think Adia Victoria came out with a song about the South, and so I think, and then Rhiannon Giddens has released a lot of political stuff last year. So I think the climate of 20. Say that.
Layla McCalla, who was also in the Carolina Chocolate Drops, did that whole tribute to Langston Hughes, which is just jaw-droppingly intense.
So I think the climate of 2020 really brought out some of this, because we started talking about some of the roots of this genre back in the 60s, being like with the Staple Singers. But I think what's happened, I think in 2020 is you've had these collaborations for these kind of activist singles. So you had Under the Devil's Knee, written about George Floyd. You had Rhiannon Giddens, I think, did one track with the I hope I'm not messing this up, but the Resistance Revival Choir. Have you seen this? It's like a Black feminist activist choir. I think it's mixed. I think it's Black and white women, but it's an all women activist choir out of New York, I believe. I think they're kind of like what the Freedom Singers were, back in the day. You've seen these folks putting out, these songs that are about the tragedy of police violence, the tragedies of domestic violence, the tragedies of mass incarceration. So you're seeing these really important artists that we're talking about today, also talking about the issues that are so pertinent in these communities. And I also love, for sure, hip hop has been there right alongside. So you've seen this renaissance really in agitational, provocative protest music. And hip hop has been really, and R&B and soul as well. So I think and even in film, I think there's been a Black renaissance in cultural production around. I haven't watched the new movie yet that just dropped, but there's a movie about Fred Hampton that just came out yesterday. Speaking of all these complicated issues around the South, did you see Black Klansman by Spike Lee? I mean, there's another example of really forcing us to look at this stuff in more deeper ways than we have previously done, especially people that look like us. I think need to keep looking at this stuff too.
Yeah, what you were talking about a second ago, I see a lot of people in my Facebook feed my age or in my age, talk about how, they're just, where'd all the protest music go? And I'm like, well, it's there, it's out there. You just have to listen to it. Also, I know a lot of people say, well, I really like Rhiannon Giddens or whatever, but you won't find them listening to other Black music. I like them when they're playing my music. And they don't say this, these people don't say this, but I like them when they're playing my music, but I don't want to hear, I don't want to stretch too much and listen to hip hop or something, And so it's just, it's breaking down barriers. I think it's a constant. It's a constant. we always have to be aware of breaking down barriers, wherever those barriers are.
I was in Smithville, Tennessee, and Cookville's like 35,000 people. We've got a big hospital, a university. Smithville is one of these outlying towns within the orbit of Cookville. And I used to live much closer to Smithville. I lived in a town called Liberty. Actually, I lived in the woods on a hippie commune. I think I mentioned that at the beginning of the show. But anyway, I remember
I lived on a hippie commune.
I drove into Smithville one day, probably late 90s, early zeros. And there's this guy, young white guy with the pickup truck. And in my mind, I'm stereotyping him, right? I always got profiled. So I used to have really, really long hair. I'm starting to grow it back out again. But I used to have really, really
hair.
really long hair and a goatee. And when Bonnaroo started, you'd go into a grocery store or something. You're not from here. And are you in town for Bonnaroo? And I'd look at my arm like I was looking at it would be like March, like Bonnaroo is until June, you're like, are you in town for Bonnaroo? Because they had
a little early.
so I knew what it feels like to get kind of profiled. But anyway, so I'm profiling this kid in my head, and he cranks the engine, and he's got really good speakers, and he starts blasting NWA. In this grocery store parking lot in this all white community in rural Tennessee,
but young
white guy,
young white guys listen to that. I mean, hip hop went mainstream because it hit the suburbs and the rural areas. That doesn't surprise me that a young kid, and and I don't know this, so I'm not saying it, but he could be just as racist as he could be and still going around bumping, NWA. That doesn't really mean a lot unless, when I think of collaborations between, I don't know, Americana artists and hip hop artists, I'm thinking of hip hop artists who actually are doing, socially conscious stuff. Not that MWA didn't. It's just that they were hugely popular at a certain time. So a lot of suburban white guys who were listening to it, like they listened to heavy metal or something, and that's good. I mean, I guess if you're listening, it's funny. I see the internet's taught us a whole lot. I see people who claim to like the Grateful Dead or Bruce Springsteen or Bob Dylan or whatever, and they're just as conservative and racist as they can be. So I'm like, Rage Against the Machine. I saw somebody, complaining about, I love Rage Against the Machine, but that politics stuff, so that's what they are, It kind of blows my mind what people listen to and then still where their head's at. I don't get it.
Hippies, right-wing hippies is such a big thing right now. And it did not start with the QAnon shaman.
No.
I was on a thread kind of understanding that whole right-wing yoga practitioner, right-wing hippie. And this friend of mine who's a big Fish fan and also a Deadhead, and I do dabble heavily in the Grateful Dead. Mm-hmm. She showed pictures of this guy that he had been posting on. He drives this multicolored, looks like the Ken Kesey bus, and he's a fish head, and he's taking his Ken Kesey looking, fish bus to DC for the insurrection, maybe he's going to sell grilled cheese sandwiches, and play fish while he's trying to, attack Mike Pence. Who knows? I mean, the dissonance.
Yeah, the cognitive dissonance
it's unreal. But you know what? I think this is a time of great possibility, and we began the conversation talking about your book, Dixie Lullaby, and how hopeful you were about the New South. Mm-hmm. I think the New South is still coming. We've just taken this very bizarre detour because of Trumpism. And I think it is Trumpism. And I think Trumpism is destined to die, but it's not going to go peacefully into the night. I mean, just like George Wallace and all that other stuff that you were born into. I was kind of a little bit late for that, but it's gonna fade eventually. But not without people talking about the hard issues.
It's a poison. It's a poison that's poisoned a lot of people, I think. And I mean, I am by nature an optimistic person. I have a lot of hope. I mean, if you're, we're talking about recovery earlier. If you're in recovery from an addiction, you by definition have to be hopeful, because you're depending on your hope and your faith that things, that things can be better. And so by nature, that's what I am. But it's really been tough. The last 4 years have been really, really tough to watch things tumble quickly backward and see this cultural, gulf created. It was already there, because it doesn't happen. One person doesn't do this, but it's been very difficult. We're still digging our way out of it, and hopefully, the trial that's going on now will help just at least put this stuff on the record, just how hideous and non-American it is.
I woke up thinking this morning, Mark, this is going to sound really funny, but I come from the other side, and as a lifelong activist, I woke up this morning and the thought I had in my head was the quote unquote pro-America side is so anti-American now that it makes us people who would like, have marched against every war and burned a flag. It makes the anti-American crowd seem so patriotic by comparison. It's like, who are these people?
I think it was Phil Oakes that said, he had deep love of his country, and he was one of the most, out there politically active folk singers of them all. He was a lot more clearly left and clearly more political than Dylan. But he said, I love the country, and if you really love the country, you have to question the country, and that's what that's all about. Burning flags and draft cards and stuff like that. What these folks are doing, it's really
I got that internet lag again. Thankfully, it had gone away for most of our broadcast. We'll see what it looks like on the archive. But my guest for the hour has been Mark Kemp, author and music journalist from North Carolina. We've been really wandering through a lot of topics that are dear to us, but we want you all to listen to Black country, Americana, and folk artists, not just this month because it's Black History Month, but all the time. And next Saturday on Teacher on the Radio, on live radio here in Cookeville, Tennessee at 88.5 FM, we're going to, and available on the Stream-In app. Mark, I'll send you good instructions so you can catch it next week. I'm going to put together a playlist based on Mark's suggestions and my own, based on this conversation, and we'll do just 2 hours of mostly music, 11 a.m. Central-ish. I tend to run about 5 minutes late to everything, about next Saturday, and we'll get to hear some of these great songs. Mark, I wanted to ask you to do something very old school and very old-fashioned. If you will do, and we'll do it right now while we're live, and I'll just drop it into the mix next Saturday. If you would do me a radio ID. Now, let me tell you what you're going to say. You're going to say that you can say whatever you want about yourself, and then you're listening to 88.5 FM, Cookeville, Tennessee, the Teacher on the Radio program. And I'll drop your voice in between some of these songs that you're going to help me pick out for next week. Would you do that for me? Would you give me a little Teacher on the Radio ID?
Yeah. I'm a little older than you, so I'm forgetful. It's 88.5 FM.
FM Cookeville, and it's the Teacher on the Radio program. Yep.
Okay, let me do this. Mark Kemp, author of Dixie Lullaby, A Story of Music, Race, and New Beginnings in a New South. You're listening to 88.5 Cookeville, Teacher on the Radio. So,
what else have we not covered? I think we're coming up on an hour. This feels like a good hour conversation. Is there anything else you'd like to drop before we go about our Saturday?
No, I don't think so. This has been a wonderful conversation. I love talking about this stuff.
I promise to stay in touch. And you all, if you love music and you love the South and you're a progressive, you will absolutely adore Mark Kemp's book, Dixie Lullaby. It's that book that I bought it, read it, bought another copy to give to friends. And I will continue to follow you on the socials as you do me. And I'll make sure that we have a way to share this later with your friends, and also to share the broadcast next Saturday, where I'll play a bunch of this great music we've talked about today. So this has been an episode of Ordinary Takes. I'm Andrew Smith, and this is Mark Kemp, and we'll be around. We'll see you online. Thanks for tuning in this afternoon, or to the archive version at Ordinary Takes.
Thanks, Andrew.